All right, ladies and gentlemen, chapter number 10. So before we go through the chapter 10 material, I just want to talk about what we saw in the last chapter. So chapter 10 is the 1980s. Of course, before the 1980s, we have the 1970s. The 1970s during the Cold War is that era known as détente, right? That lessening of Cold War tensions as a response to the increasing of Cold War tensions that we saw during the 1960s with the Cuban Missile Crisis. So during the détente period, we see all sorts of nuclear arms treaties that are signed between the US and the USSR, right? We see SALT I and also the ABM. This is good. And then Christmas Day in 1979, the Soviets, they invade Afghanistan to prop up a failing Marxist dictatorship, and that ultimately spells the end of détente. Now, moving into chapter number 10, we see two new leaders come to the forefront in the Cold War. Yes, I know there's a lot of them, but these two that we're going to see in the 1980s are really, really important. The first leader, of course, is Ronald Reagan, that old foe of communism who since the 1940s had been warning Americans about how evil socialism and communism is. So that's the American president, right? He gets elected in 1981. And then in 1985, after three leaders die in the Soviet Union by natural causes, right? But a guy by the name of Mikhail Gorbachev comes to power in 1985. And they start a friendship that dramatically changes the course of the Cold War. Now, let's have a look specifically at the chapter 10 questions. So number 32 says, in what way did President Reagan intend to defeat communism and the USSR once and for all? The way he was going to do this is by basically a massive military buildup, right? They spoke in the documentary about how with Ronald Reagan, I want you guys to understand, like in the early 1980s, the US had been surpassed by the Soviets when it came to their military power. America actually looked weak relative to the military power of the Soviet Union, and Reagan said that is a no-no. And what he embarked upon was a massive military buildup to the tune of about $1.5 trillion over 5 years. Yes, trillion dollars with a T, right? We don't throw the T number around a lot, even in contemporary times. Here in the year 2020. So yeah, guys, they built new tanks, new ships, new fighters, new missiles, new everything to reinvigorate the American military. And at the peak of spending, the US government was spending $34 million an hour on defense spending. $34 million an hour. Let that sink in for a second, right? So basically what Reagan intended to do was to have the US be back in a position of strength. Now, knowing that this is the Cold War, knowing that this is a war of prestige, as I've said many, many times, the Soviets have to then in turn keep up to the American spending. So as America starts to reinvigorate their military, the Soviets have to respond or look weak. And it was mentioned, I believe in the documentary again, that at one point more than half of the Soviet economy was spent on trying to keep up with this reinvigorated arms race, which ultimately would spell disaster for them once we get to Chernobyl in number 38. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, and let's talk about number 33. Number 33, another doctrine, right? We had the Truman Doctrine, we had the Brezhnev Doctrine, now we have the Reagan Doctrine. What was the Reagan Doctrine? Remember before, guys, we talked about this idea of containment, right, which was sort of articulated by Truman. This Reagan Doctrine, instead of trying to contain communism and keep it from getting bigger, what the Reagan Doctrine wanted to do was actually actively make it smaller. So the Reagan Doctrine asserted the right of the United States to support people anywhere in the world who are resisting against communism. Instead of containing it, they actually wanted to roll it back and make it smaller, ideally non-existent. So this was a rather bold vision for American foreign policy at this time, and the Russians, the Soviets, weren't too happy about it. Now, you want to hear what else they weren't happy about? That's number 34, this thing known as the SDI. So to defend America, knowing that these things called ICBMs, or intercontinental ballistic missiles, knowing that they could be coming over the top of the world from the Soviet Union and striking the United States of America, what Reagan decided the US needed was a space-based missile interception shield, where satellites up in space would have lasers on them, right? Missiles being shot down by lasers. So these satellites would have lasers on them, and if a missile was known to be approaching American airspace, they would zap them out of the air. So it was basically like a missile shield over the United States of America to stop Soviet ICBMs from coming into the United States. It was a really neat idea. It never actually happened. It was called Star Wars. Now, the second part of number 34, what was it also known as? That was Star Wars, right? So it was a cool idea, but it never happened. The Soviets actually denounced the SDI as a new way for America to launch a nuclear war. So they weren't very happy about this either. Now, number 35. It says, how did President Reagan use the Korean Airline massacre as a tool to polarize American opinion about the USSR? All right. So in 1983, a Korean passenger jet was flying from New York to Seoul, South Korea, and it was going to Korea basically via Anchorage, Alaska, right? And then it was going to fly across. As this plane was flying from Anchorage towards Korea, it accidentally veered into Soviet airspace. So the Soviets saw a large airplane blip on their radar, and they assumed that it was an American bomber, and they shot it down, right? They shot it down. It was a total mistake, and 269 people were killed aboard this plane, right? Korean airline flight number 007, right? 007. And President Reagan went on TV and asserted that it wasn't a mistake, despite the fact that it was. So he was trying to basically drum up support for the view that the Soviets were evil. And, you know, he said that this is, you know, a hallmark of the evil empire that is the Soviet Union, that wantonly disregards normal precepts of human existence and human rights and all these things. And as Reagan sort of reached a fever pitch in his speech, again, the Soviet Union believed that this was Reagan beating the drums of war once again. And ultimately, guys, thankfully, the war drums were sort of put on hold later in 1983, when in number 36, a TV or made-for-TV movie called The Day After was aired on ABC, right? American Broadcast Company. And this movie was a fictionalized depiction of what would happen if the USSR and the United States went to nuclear war with each other. And it was a sobering glimpse of what would happen. Now, this movie was watched by President Reagan, and it made him change from warmonger, or at least supposed warmonger in the eyes of the Soviet Union, to peacemaker, right? Soon hereafter, in 1984, Reagan gives a speech about how the US and the USSR need to seek common ground, about how people just want peace and security. And if the Soviets are ready to seek peace and security in the world, then America's ready too. So it was an eye-opening thing for the American public and for American President Reagan that nuclear war is not winnable. Both sides lose should nuclear war happen. Now, if you want to check out the program The Day After, just go to YouTube and search The Day After 1983, and you'll find the entire program. At about 1 hour into the program, they show the nukes going off as the United States was struck by the Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles, and the scene of destruction lasts about 3 minutes. And to be honest, it's horrifying, right? It shows people getting vaporized. It shows, buildings being toppled by the nuclear blast. Like, it is a really, really terrible thing to watch. And that could have been the future. Now, number 37, what is significant about the difference in leadership style when it comes to Mikhail Gorbachev? Okay, so guys, Gorbachev was a different kind of Soviet leader. He was a young man, relatively speaking, right? I think he was in his 50s when he gained leadership of the Soviet Union. And he was also university educated and reform-minded. He was definitely a Marxist-Leninist, but he saw a different vision for the Soviet Union. He wanted to have positive relations with the United States of America. He wanted to basically have the Soviet Union go on a different path. However, unfortunately, that path that he was going to guide the Soviet Union on was interrupted in number 38 when in 1986 in the Soviet Republic of Ukraine, there was the Chernobyl disaster, right? So in 1986, guys, in Chernobyl, Ukraine, a nuclear reactor blew up, and it was the largest nuclear disaster the world had ever seen up to that point. The amount of nuclear radiation that was released by the Chernobyl disaster was more than 100 times that released by the Hiroshima and Nagasaki attack by the United States, right? The detonation on the two Japanese cities combined, right? So more than 100 times combined release of radiation then was released in Japan to end the Second World War with the Japanese. So the Chernobyl disaster, guys, what it did is it demonstrated that the Soviet Union, the Soviet government was really incapable of dealing with this disaster, right? Like it led to people losing confidence in their government. The Soviet government really just didn't know what to do. And this caused a lot of people to question the Soviet system. So yeah, it was a system that was corrupt and incompetent, and the people soon wanted some dramatic change. Change will come in the last chapter of the documentary here. So hopefully, folks, you've been enjoying this. You've been learning something. I find this documentary absolutely fascinating. I was a Cold War kid. We hated the Russians. We hated the Soviets, right? We hated that evil empire. Even as a Canadian, right, with our American neighbors, there was no love lost between Canada and the Soviet Union as well. So yeah, we're about to embark then, guys, on chapter 11, which is the last chapter, right? We're now in 1986. By 1989, things really start to fall apart for the Soviet Union. So that is it for chapter 10, and we'll see you in chapter 11. Peace, and I love you guys.